So Bing was worried about me setting too high of expectations, but he didn't need to worry about that, right?
Sorry, I'm late. We were eating at Zest.
What's
around
that?
The corner. We were eating at Zest around the corner. We
barely made it. You did though. You made it.
Yeah.
You know, Bing's really easy to work with, but he insists that people who interview him wear the same shirt as him. So that was. So I did.
Yeah. It was a power move. Yeah. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, we have microphones here. If anyone has comments or if they have questions that came up, I'm gonna. I still have more questions. I talked to him last week, but so I'll get the ball rolling. One of the things I wanted to ask is that when you're a filmmaker, like when do you know when this thing is finished? I mean, it's been such a process for you, this film. And one of the things I've read you had talked about is that you kept going because you were looking for answers. And there's this thing you said you wanted to create this holistic picture, a holistic picture that you yourself hadn't really seen in a film before. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to films that deal with violence in the home, things like domestic violence and child abuse, what I've seen is just tonally something that's really stark and dark and gut-wrenching. But I think if you survive something like that, or if you are experiencing it, that's not only what you feel. I mean, you still feel, the feeling of freedom when you're, finding whatever it is that helps you get by. You still feel laughter and joy when you're with your friends. I mean, you even feel love and sometimes with the people that hurt you. I mean, so I wanted to sort of create something that reflected what I felt was the lived experience and what I feel like is the lived experience for people who are in those situations.
Did you know that? When did you know that? When did you start to think about that? Was that early on in the process, or as you started to see the scenes unfold and as you start to put them together?
I think that the idea of like holistic emotionality kind of came later. I mean, this whole thing's just sort of like snowballed into, I think it was a lot more about fatherhood and child abuse. And then when Nina revealed to me that Zach was abusive, that's when I realized, like this both is about domestic violence, but it also hits home in a way where I felt like I had to sort of enter the film as a character, because I didn't set out with I resisted for a long time, even after people had suggested that I enter the film.
What made you decide you should?
I guess it was a feedback screening where in New York, one of the many that we've did over the years, and there was this editor named Jean Chen who was there, and it was mostly just her saying like, you have to, because so in the feedback screening, or in the feedback session afterwards, I wasn't really in the film. There were these moments of sort of me interacting from behind the camera that was still in there, but no one really knew anything about me from watching the film. And so afterwards, when I explained my connection with the story, with the issues, people were like, you should put yourself in the film. And one of those people is Jean Chen, who I deeply respected. And then so afterwards, I was talking with her, and she was just like asking me about like my relationship with my mom. And I started telling her a little bit, and she was like, oh my God, you have to, if you're comfortable, you should totally, try to work that in too. So.
What did your mom say when you asked first that you wanted to interview her?
Well, we weren't that close growing up. I mean, she was always working, and, she was a single mom for a while, like leaving me home alone. And so we didn't have much of a relationship. And by the time, so I've been living in Chicago for 10 years. And, when I was 19, that was the last time I really slept in the same house as her because of how bad things had become. While I was making the film, my stepfather died. And my mom had moved out on her own in her own apartment, and it was sort of, we were sort of starting to build a relationship a little bit, but it felt sort of weird and estranged. But basically, I just, she knew that I was making skate videos and short films and stuff growing up. So I just called her and I was like, hey, do you want to be in this documentary I've been working on for a while? And she just said, yeah. And I just showed up with, a sound person and a camera person.
That was the interview.
That was the interview, but like the intent of it was like, I feel like if you go through something traumatic as a child, like one of the most difficult things is to just like know what your narrative is. It just seems like a black hole in your life. So I think my original intention in interviewing my brother and the skate shop owner and my mom was just, let's just like tell the story. And I'd been making rough cuts all along the way. And so after that interview, I like tried all these different versions of that interview with my mom, but it didn't really quite work. And I started working with my co-editor, Josh, last summer. And the scene that you see in the film, the main portion of the interview, like that's basically what he did first try, after we had talked about the story. But so, yeah, I mean, so that what's effective about the interview is like what's not being said, It's not about like building up our story. It's about, what is not being said and what is our relationship now, today.
What I liked about the shots of the interview is it just seemed like what we saw was the arc of what had happened. Like you start by saying, tell me about Dennis. Like, who's Dennis? What do you mean? Who's Dennis? And then the thing builds and you come to this moment at the end. I mean, I'm sure there was plenty of editing that went on, but it seemed like the whole piece of that conversation and that revelation was there in those scenes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of all we needed.
I want to ask you about the title. Part of it is I guess bridging that gap between fathers and sons, right? But part of it's also there's something about skateboarding in gaps, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, there's literal gaps that skateboarders traverse over. I think skateboarders understand skateboarding is 90% mental, and it's very little physical. It's just like if you can mentally picture yourself doing something, you'll eventually be able to do it. And so I think there's something to be said about that in terms of, building relationships with family members, building relationships with someone of the opposite gender, sort of minding the chasm between what it means to be a child and what it means to grow up into an adult.
So when you were shooting, you started shooting when you were about, 14, right? First started doing videos?
Yeah, so I broke my arm when I was 14, and I was working as a dishwasher. I got my first job, and I saved up a little bit of money and went on eBay and got a soccer mom camera. And I fell in love with making skate videos, in the same way that I fell in love with skateboarding before I started filming.
Was that what they were? They were just skateboarding videos? I mean, were you thinking about documentaries or narratives or anything like that at that time?
I was definitely pushed. I felt like I wasn't in a void, just pointing the camera randomly. I was definitely pushed by a couple other friends who had been filming for longer even, when they're 12 or 13. And they had skate videographers that they looked up to, and they had a style and an aesthetic. And so they showed me other skate videos that, I sort of latched onto. And I felt like, I was always trying to grow and push the boundaries of what it meant to make a skate video. For example, Spike Jonze started out as a skate videographer, and he was just, he had crazy things. He would just try explosions and skits and, green screen. And it was I felt like I was emulating that too.
Wanted you to talk a little, we'd mentioned this a bit on the, hold on, I'm going to hold that thought and let you ask a question. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the process that you went through to get your 4 friends to give their blessing to this project? Yeah,
I mean, so I felt like I'd always, in a way, I'd been looking for free therapy my whole life as well. So I feel like I was the guy in high school who would while people are doing beer bongs, whatever, I would sidle up to people and be like, hey, so what was your dad like growing, And so people, I thrived off those conversations. So I think they sort of knew me as someone who did that anyway. But obviously there's this trust there as skateboarders that so I'm 29 and KUER is 22. He was considerably, I didn't really know, I mean, he knew who I was, but I didn't know who he was until about 5 years ago when I just did an interview with him. Zach's 27, so he's a little bit more my age. So he sort of knew me as someone who, was always trying to dig beneath people's skin a little bit. But in terms of the project and it being completed, like we showed everyone the film before we picture locked. We felt like that was the ethical thing to do. And that, I mean, everyone is sort of overtaken by the story and seeing themselves in an honest portrayal that no one really had any notes to change anything, so.
That says something about Zach, doesn't it? Because this reveals some pretty honest stuff about him. And the fact that he was still willing to let you keep it in the film, I mean, I think that's, I don't know, that just says something about him, I think. He's willing to be honest like that in front of everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never know exactly how Zach feels on the inside, but I can say that I think him and everybody in the film really needed a trusting voice to talk to, and I think a lot of young people feel like that. Yeah, I mean, he thought his portrayal was going to be worse, so he was relieved in many ways. He said that. Yeah. I mean, it was great watching him with KUER because it's like he would, every time he'd cry or laugh on screen, he'd cry or laugh in person. So it's like watching this mirror in real life. So I think Nina had the hardest time because she, it's like she had to relive this relationship that she thought she had gotten over, but she hadn't really processed it. So it, opened up some old wounds. And so we had, in the post showing them process, we had to sort of go through this process of being there for them as well.
Shooting the skateboarding scenes, I wanted to ask you about just the process of it, because one of the things you told me, we talked about this last week, was that you wanted to shoot them in a way that you hadn't really seen done before, and you used this glide cam technique, which is kind of old school, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like the poor person's answer to the Steadicam. But I've been working as a camera assistant in the union for like 6 years, and so I worked with these Steadicam operators, and I came to understand it as this dance that, as this something, as a real art. Because like actors never hit their marks, and no matter how much you rehearse, like it's just it's just based off of your intuition and your muscle memory. And I just thought it would be a great tool for skateboarding because that's what skateboarding is. You're never gonna get a perfect sort of run, but I felt like I had enough of a knowledge of like how skateboarders move and think that if I just had something that felt intuitive, that almost as if I could like have the same freedom of filming and pointing a lens as I felt like I did on a skateboard, then we could do something special. I think the biggest thing is it's eye level rather than like pointed down and up, which is usually how skateboarding is filmed to glorify the tricks. But for this, it was really more about trying to translate the emotion.
When people say this is a skateboarding film, how do you react to that? Like you've mentioned on the air that the marketing company wanted to say it's a skateboarding film, but it's not really a skateboarding film.
Yeah, I mean, I just, it's difficult because people really want to latch on to things, and you see a movie poster, and it's just really easy to just have a 1-second decision in your head where you categorize it and compartmentalize it into a certain type of story to help you understand what that story is. And I know skateboarding, the word skateboarding like has such a baggage in people's minds, when it comes to skateboarding media, that I just didn't think it was worth even putting in, and I tried really like fighting to reduce the use of that word. I felt like coming of age was a more universally accepted, compartmentalized story that people have in our zeitgeist. So I was really pushing hard to have that be the branding word or whatever. So
it's funny. I have to say, I got 2 emails from people saying, do those boys realize they have to be really careful? And I'm not. Are they wearing helmets and? Yeah, you should see this film. There's that lovely moment where you ask KUER what he got out of this, the process of the film and that interaction that you had. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because what do you think you got out of that process? It comes through in that conversation you have with your mom. where you say that, yeah, maybe I need to move on now and stop dwelling in the past or whatever. And I'm wondering, did this process, this film, like the editing of it, the creating of it, the working through what it was about, did that help in a personal way?
I think it helped open up wounds. I don't think it helped sort of suture them or help me dig around in any way that was vulnerable and truthful to how, sort of what I needed to do to process and move forward. I think in many ways I used the camera, since I was young as a shield,
Yeah.
So I didn't have to be vulnerable, so I didn't have to, really interact. And I felt like I did the same thing here, with this film, it was always like the process of it was like, what do I need to do next? Like, what's the next step in telling this story? When's the next shoot date or whatever? It became very practical. Even in moments like that, where like Kier and I having that moment, I mean, in the back of my head, I'm still thinking about, framing and focus and, like how is this going to be used in the film later, maybe. It's not until, but I started seeing a therapist a couple years ago because I got sort of, this film, I sort of lost sleep over it sometimes. So I don't think, I think if I wouldn't have done this film, I wouldn't have started seeing a therapist, which is an amazing experience. I think, yeah, I mean, this is my PSA for therapy. Like, people see it as like something that you need to go to get something fixed, but in reality, it's just like, people go to the spa or get a massage. I mean, it's like a spa or massage for your soul. I mean, that's all it is. It's just all about just self-care. But I mean, I was always the one asking the questions. It's now in this like, now that the film is getting out, I'm doing Q&As and stuff like this. This is sort of also my therapy.
Yeah. Free therapy.
Yeah.
So glad.
Yeah.
What are you working on these days? What are the things you're thinking about in terms of films?
Just, very much the same, similar themes, coming. But so there's been this project in development for a year. We sort of just got greenlit. It's a documentary about how we access memory and how memory changes when we access memories, especially if it's buried beneath trauma, and we sort of built up a fictitious bubble around it, as it pertains to young men who experience gun violence in Chicago.
Yes.
On that really excellent transitional note. So I really appreciated the film. And for me, as someone who works with young people, I work with kids who are incarcerated long-term, and we make a podcast. And what's often I find they often go into places of trauma really quickly. But with the girls, they have a lot easier time like accessing their stories and telling their stories and getting emotional in those spaces. And so watching this was really, it was really, it hit home in a big way, like how visceral it was to see men cry, especially in like talking about childhood trauma. So I guess I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the importance of stories and visuals representation of male vulnerability and male trauma, and how did that aspect of this film maybe help you consider your own emotionality as a man?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I felt like I like similar to Kier. I felt like I'm very emotional. I'm just naturally emotional. I feel like children just are that way. But it's like what Zach says. Like somewhere along the line, like we all sort of lose that, and we learn how to repress. We learn how it's not okay to feel. Certainly, my stepfather taught me that, in very direct ways. Like if he would beat me, and then if I cried, he'd beat me more and it's like part of his message was, like, if you could stop crying, I'll stop beating you, basically. So it was like literally getting conditioned to not feel pain and not let yourself feel emotions. But I think that's what I saw in Kier pretty early on, was like this really, like there was a part of him that wasn't repressing it, and he was fighting it, and he didn't really know how to sort of handle it, especially because he didn't really feel comfortable being emotional around his friends. I mean, that conversation where we commiserated about crying after getting beaten was like our first interview together. And, it just lasted a couple hours, and it was, so we really connected. But it's not like, but then we sort of went back to what we know, right? Which is like not talking about it. I don't know, I forgot the question. I don't know the question.
I think that was right.
Yeah.
I mean, just how men deal with, or don't deal with their tears.
Yeah. But there's a reason for it, and, I think part of it's just, we can't just flip off like everything that we've learned. We sort of have to understand like how we're conditioned and try to slowly undo it. So,
yes.
First of all, thank you for being a filmmaker. I'm not. I have no idea what it takes to do that, but 6 years is incredible. So thank you for that. But I also wanted to say thank you for portraying surfers, skaters. It's the same thing for me in a different light. I grew up in that world, and the scene that struck me the most was watching him trim the grip tape. That I hid for a long time, for a little while there with my friends, and you did something that's, just like she said, incredibly vulnerable and powerful, and it's a portrayal of people that's entirely different than what Thrasher puts out there, what people want to feel. It's people, and that's so transformative. So thank you for that. And I don't know who said it or where I heard it. Might have been Doug's show or something, but somebody said, when I see kids skating, trying a trick over and over and just falling and hitting themselves, I know those kids are going to be okay. And you're doing that, so thank you. Keep making films. It's amazing.
Thank you.
That was a theme, I have to say, that we talked about in the on the show after, like that thing that comes up right toward the end where there's pain associated with skateboarding, like good pain in some way, or there's something about getting a trick, getting a move right, and it just takes over and over and over and over and over again, and there's a kind of pain that's involved in it, and that seemed like a kind of a theme in some way to me in the film. At least that occurred to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it. You know, it's a lot of it is about control. At home, you can't control your pain. There's no sense of causality. You could do the right thing or the wrong thing. You might still feel pain or witness pain. But when you're skateboarding, you know, like if you fall, it's just you're dictated by the laws of physics and yourself. You know, no one else is doing that. So at least you control it, and I think that feels really nice. It's almost like, oh yeah, I am controlling it every time I feel pain. It's like a reaffirmation of your control. So.
Hey, I just want to ask, so over the multiple years that you were doing this film, what else was going on in your life, and what percentage of your life was this film? Were you focused mostly on this, or was this a side project you would come back to every once in a while? Just a little bit about that.
It was mostly a side project. I mean, I worked on my own, I worked without funding for 4 years. For the 2 years, I really worked on my own, and then I did a fellowship with Kartemquin Films, and they sort of brought me on as a co-production, and you know, having their name attached made it more likely to get grants. I still wrote probably like 50 grants and got rejected 48 times until actually, you know, like 2016, late 2016, a broadcaster, POV, which is an arm of PBS, came on board. And then the bigger funding arm of PBS, ITVS, came on board last February. And that really allowed me to, you know, hire an editor and like a composer and everything to finish the film.
We should say that that filmmaking group, that's Steve James and Hoop Dreams, seems like a really cool group of artists talking about film in Chicago.
Yeah, I think people do it for the love. I mean, it's a collective, you know, they work with a lot of independent producers, and I think, you know, it's like it's just a really valuable resource to have in the Midwest, you know, that's outside of LA or New York. So.
Yes.
Hi. I was interested in the fact that there were no female skateboarders, and I seem to see a lot more female skateboarders now on the road, on the streets. Is that changing, or what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge, you know, we're seeing the biggest growth of female skateboarders that in the history of skateboarding right now. I mean, there's it's incredible. It's happening everywhere. But for this first couple of years, when I was just sort of I sort of traveled around the country and interviewed skateboarders about, you know, what it was like growing up. You know, it was a survey film at first before it sort of developed into a character-driven film. And in that survey film, I had several female skateboarders. You know, one was a mom of two. You know, one was a teenager. One was in her 30s who had gone through, who had survived domestic violence in her life. But ultimately, you know, I wanted to make a film that was, you know, let the characters and the story lead first, and I just found Zach and KUER to be compelling to keep following them. I did work pretty hard to sort of, maintain this thread of mothers and women and their importance in this, grander picture of what's going on in Rockford in these boys' lives. But to answer your question, I mean, more females than ever are skateboarding, and they're getting more support and more female-led support, more men-led support. I mean, I think it's incredible. I mean, I still feel like it's a very white, male-dominated subculture, but it's changing.
You feel proud of this film?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not embarrassed of it. Yeah.
I think you should. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks
very much.
I want to say the dog is okay. The dog is safely with Zach's parents. So
The dog is okay?
The dog is okay.
Yeah, people wonder that, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks all for coming.
Thank you.